16th, 1944. German tanks roll into the Ardennes Forest of Belgium.
And at that point, the heavens open up and all hell breaks loose.
The next lane we came to, there is the only Tiger tank I ever saw.
They attack American lines in one last desperate attempt to change the course of the war.
Und dann auf einmal auf einen Schlag ging die Ardennen.
And it started in one fell swoop, and we chased away the
Alles
Americans.
liegen stehen, also wir sind praktisch nur.
They dropped everything and ran away.
The Americans respond with one of the biggest and most daring armored counterattacks in the history of tank warfare.
There's tanks being hit, bang, 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 all over the place.
At stake is the fate of Western Europe. This is the Battle of the Bulge.
Now it's a matter of survival.
The Ardennes region on the Belgian-German border is a picture postcard of majestic forests, deep gorges, and rolling valleys. It's also a notorious killing ground. This rugged part of the European heartland is a gateway to France and the ports of the North Sea. Armies have fought here since Roman times. And in December of 1944, the Ardennes once again erupts, this time in one of the biggest and bloodiest armored clashes of the Second World War. December 16th, 5:30 a.m. German artillery breaks the pre-dawn calm. And soon after, more than 1,000 German tanks attack U.S. forces along a 140-kilometer front. Hitler's aim is to stop the Allied advance across France and Belgium toward the German homeland. Through the summer and fall of 1944, the Allies have pushed the Germans 850 kilometers across Europe. But now, as they near the German border, their supply lines grow thin, and the advance loses steam. Hitler hopes to capitalize on this and prepares a massive counterattack in the Ardennes. It's his last big roll of the dice. The German attack plan is to smash the weak American line along the German border with Belgium and Luxembourg, and seize the bridges over the Meuse River, clearing the way for a push onto Antwerp.
Hitler gave a strategic goal, which was to capture Antwerp harbor, and with that huge Allied supply dump. The second goal was basically more tactical. If he had succeeded in pinning down about 25 plus Allied divisions in the Ardennes, which were resting, this would result in a tremendous amount of losses for the Americans and for the British, and would eventually bring them back on the negotiation table.
The Germans estimate they have only 3 days before the Allies can mount an effective response in the Ardennes. They need to strike quickly with a massive, highly mobile armored force. They assemble 8 Panzer divisions, over 1,700 armored vehicles, including hundreds of Tigers, and over 400 Panzer Mark V's, the deadly Panther. The Panther is armed with a high-velocity 75mm armor-piercing gun and is protected by 80mm of sloping frontal armor that deflects incoming fire. It can do 30 kilometers an hour, even over the roughest terrain, giving it an edge in the tough winter conditions of the Ardennes. The Germans secretly muster their enormous armored force at night over 8 weeks and wait for bad weather to ground Allied warplanes. On the morning of December 16th, the temperature falls well below freezing, and there are snowstorms across the Ardennes. Everything is in place, and the Germans strike.
Dann auf einmal auf einen Schlag gegen die Ardennen auf uns
And it started in one fell swoop, and we chased away the Americans. The Americans dropped everything.
Aber das Frühstück noch auf dem Tisch.
Breakfast was still standing on the tables, and they dropped everything and ran away.
Was ich
They left huge amounts of equipment,
Massen an Material,
fuel and shells.
Granaten,
The bad Germans are coming. Let's run.
etwa so ungefähr.
That's kind of what it looked like.
The Germans catch the Americans off guard, and the shape of the Ardennes battlefront begins to change, giving rise to a name that will live in U.S. military history: the Battle of the Bulge. At the spearhead of this bulge is the 5th Panzer Army, attacking the weakest part of the American line, held by the U.S. 28th Division and the handful of tanks attached to them. The M4A3 Sherman is the U.S. force's main battle tank, and it's no match for the German Panther. The Shermans are light and fast, but carry a low-velocity 75mm main gun that cannot penetrate the Panther's heavy frontal armor. Their own frontal armor is just 51mm thick, making them highly vulnerable to the firepower of the Panthers. Spread across a front over 24 kilometers long, the 28th has only 32 Sherman tanks, 57 anti-tank guns, and thousands of battle-weary men.
The Ardennes was an ideal territory to accommodate tired troops, weary troops. During that time, the 28th Division received a steady stream of reinforcements from the States. So in other words, young soldiers that had just not seen active combat yet. That's why all these troops here that bedded down on the night from December 15 to 16, they were totally caught by surprise.
One of the exhausted soldiers holding the front line with the 28th Division is 23-year-old John Marshall of the 707th Tank Battalion.
When the bulge broke, we were just going to eat. This lieutenant comes with his club and he knocked all the mess kits out of your hand. Leave them lay, get on your tanks and assemble down at the bottom of the town. They were frozen. And the oil settles down to the bottom of the motor. The top of the motor has no oil at all, and the oil now is sludgy, and as a result, it wasn't gonna move, and we couldn't get it started. And that's when the tanks pulled out on us. We started putting everything you're not supposed to do. I think we had 5 Bunsen burners on the motor and under the motor and everything else. And luckily, we finally got it started.
Marshall searches for the rest of his tank unit, unaware that the Germans have already broken through the 28th Division's line. But he's lost, and eventually joins 2 other Shermans in the same predicament.
2 other tanks were there when we got down here. The other 2 tanks saw us come down and they says, "We'll follow you." Or we had no idea where we were going. I jumped out of our tank to guide our tank across the bridge. And when we were safely across, I pointed to the tank commander for him to do the same thing. He no sooner got over the bridge when there was a tremendous flash. The Germans under the bridge had hit him with a bazooka. And the other two tanks, they all got machine gunned when they climbed out of the tanks.
The 5th Panzer Army seems unstoppable. All that stands in their way are scattered pockets of U.S. forces, under-equipped, outnumbered, and in Marshall's case, completely lost.
We now were really on our own.
December 16th, 1944. In an effort to turn the tide of war on the Western Front, 8 Panzer divisions launch a surprise attack on American forces in the Ardennes. On the Central Front, the 5th Panzer Army breaks through thinly defended American lines. In the chaos, many Americans, like tanker John Marshall, are lost and surrounded by the advancing Germans.
We now were really on our own, hoping to find our platoon or anybody. We decided to pull off the road, and we debated what to do. So I says, I'm going to lower the gun so it looked like it was knocked out, because I don't want some son of a bitch rolling a hand grenade down the barrel. All night long, you could hear the Germans walking by, Achtung, kaputt, and all of that. They assumed that the tank was knocked out.
Das ist doch total kaputt.
The next morning, somebody saw us, whether it's the Germans or Americans, a shell come in. Allier jumped onto the road, turned left, and started going down the main road. The next lane we came to, there is the only Tiger tank I ever saw. And on both sides of it were 2 smaller tanks. And I shot at it.
The German Tiger is a 57-ton monster, almost twice as heavy as a Sherman. It's protected in places by up to 100 millimeters of steel plate. The Tiger is one of the heaviest tanks on the World War II battlefield, with an 88-millimeter main gun that can rip a Sherman to pieces. By comparison, the Sherman's a pea shooter. Its 75-millimeter main gun has a short, 3-meter barrel, producing a low muzzle velocity and a weak punch.
And you might just as well throw an orange at that wall there. It was so powerful. Why they didn't get us, I don't know. They had the whole broadside to hit. But we still kept going.
And so do the Germans. They must take the bridges over the Meuse River while overcast weather continues to ground Allied warplanes, and before the Americans bring up reinforcements. Just 20 hours into the attack, lead elements of the 5th Panzer Army are only 90 kilometers short of their objective and have already pushed 8 kilometers into Belgium. The Germans reinforce their gains and throw more and more armor into the ever-deepening Bulge, including the elite 116th Panzer Division.
We were up on this hill. We didn't take the street, but drove across the fields and meadows because of all the mines. We were approximately 1,000 meters away. From up there, we saw this tank. This tank, with its small cannon, was barely a threat for us. Jokingly, we just called it a knocking device. And the Panther. The Panther that was standing next to me shot. From the first shot, the shell hit here and actually bounced back. So instead of a hit, it bounced up. It must have hit the tube, and when the tank fired, the barrel burst. Then the second shot was fired and hit the screws that are standing out here. And they fired for a third time.
The Panther's main gun has a long 5.5-meter barrel, enabling it to penetrate Sherman armor at ranges of up to 2,000 meters.
And this is how the tank got destroyed. It was burning inside, and then we proceeded with our advance.
So the 2 or 3 first days of the German attack, the Americans were totally exhausted with constant fighting day and night and so forth, and were lacking supplies, and higher authority told them, there's nothing we can do here, retreat.
The Americans fall back towards Bastogne, a transportation hub, which includes roads to the all-important crossings along the Meuse River. Allied command issues orders. Hold Bastogne at any cost. The 101st Airborne Division is sent to reinforce the town. For 3 days in the cold and snow and without air support, the 101st and remnants of the 10th Armored Division fight off repeated attempts by the Germans to take Bastogne. On December 19th, frustrated by the stubborn U.S. defense, the 5th Panzer Army's main armored force is ordered to bypass Bastogne and continue their advance toward the bridges on the Meuse River. Concerned that Bastogne will be encircled, Allied command orders General George Patton's 3rd Army to the rescue. Patton's forces are in France, 260 kilometers away. He orders an immediate mass movement of 3 divisions north to Bastogne. At the spearhead are 127 tanks of the 4th Armored Division.
And about 8:30 that night, I was told to be ready to move. About 50 minutes after midnight, heading north. He had to turn his army 90 degrees. And that's where we went on to the Bulge. My tank and my battalion were the lead elements of Patton's 3rd Army to make this 161-mile approach march to Bastogne. The situation was absolutely unknown. We went all night, all day, over snowy, icy roads. The weather was horrible, bitter wind. The last night was under total blackout conditions. You can't imagine to have a black night and be traveling blackout. All the tanks had were little things called cat's eyes in the rear. So the tank commander is looking at the tank in front of him at the cat's eyes, and that enables him to know where he's going and how much distance he is from the tank. But I was in the front tank, and there were no cat's eyes in front of me. There was nothing. And we saw a sign that said, Neufchâteau, Bastogne. And we thought he stopped.
32 Sherman tanks of the 8th Battalion reached the outskirts of Bastogne in less than 24 hours.
That was a tough march. It was the greatest mass movement of men in the shortest period of time in military history. but every tank made it.
But by the time they arrive, the Germans have already surrounded Bastogne. The Americans in the city are trapped. And across the Ardennes, so are many others, like tanker John Marshall, who was just trying to find his way back to friendly lines.
We were hoping to find our platoon or anybody. We were moving, and as we moved up, I saw two guys come out from between the buildings and they walked down the road. They walked quite militarily. Max says to me, "Get him." And I didn't. For some reason, they weren't bothering anybody. I should have known better. I should have done what I was told. I didn't. And as they walked, they made a military left turn and went right between the barn and the house. They turned like it was on a signal, and at the end of that street, there's a tank there. And the minute they turned, that tank let the shot go, and he fires at us. It just went over. It missed the tank. Allier makes a hard left lever, and he goes down the lane. And as we go down, we could see a crowd surrendering. He looked like a kid. We knew something was wrong. As we go down, there is the two officers. And they jump up with the Panzer force, and they fire at us.
December 21st, 1944. It's day 5 of the Battle of the Bulge. The German armored offensive now extends 60 kilometers into Belgium, and many Americans are still trapped inside the Bulge. John Marshall of the 707th Tank Battalion is one of them, and he's trying to find his way back to American lines.
As we go down the lane, we could see a crowd surrendering. We knew something was wrong. And there is the two officers, and they jump up with the Panzer force.
Panzerfaust. It means tank fist, and it's one of the deadliest anti-tank weapons on the battlefield. It fires a 140-millimeter rocket at ranges of up to 60 meters and can penetrate 200 millimeters of armor, unleashing a devastating explosion inside.
And they fire at us. It missed. It missed the tank. I didn't need any orders or anything like that. You own sense, I just pressed the old solenoid to machine gun the hell out of him. And I heard a sickening clack. I said, "Spencer, the 30 caliber is jammed." And this time they were just starting to get up. He says, 75 millimeters loaded, and all you have to do is just turn your heel and press that solenoid. And I let that solenoid go in. I hit right into them. And the odd part of it is, the kid was still standing with his hands in the air, and he was holding his stubs up. So anyway, we went on.
Marshall and his crew dodge the advancing Germans for days and eventually make it back to Allied lines. On December 22nd, the German push towards the Meuse River bridges begins to slow. The rugged country northeast of Bastogne is a challenge, even for the Panthers of the 116th Panzer Division.
In Ardennes was we
It
It was much more difficult in the Ardennes because there were all these narrow forest roads.
Katastrophal.
It was catastrophic because of all the closed forest paths. Our tanks couldn't maneuver.
Und wie gesagt, es war für, also die offene freie Landschaft ist eine typische Panzer.
The open field is typical landscape for tanks, while the Ardennes were poison for the tanks.
Gift für Panzer, war nicht das Ideale.
This is where our Panther tank was hit.
Abgeschossen worden.
The first shell hit the tank track and the tank became disabled. And if the one track keeps moving, the tank turns in a circle. It turned until it was standing at an angle with its corner facing the anti-tank gun. We had no idea that the Americans were firing phosphorus grenades. You can't really bring a tank down with phosphorus grenades. They just got lucky on the first shot that they hit and disabled our track.
White phosphorus rounds are incendiaries used to create smoke screens or mark enemy targets. They burn fiercely, but have little effect against the heavy armor on a Panther tank, unless they ignite exposed ammunition or fuel.
And there is an order that all German tank troops know. You can only get out of the tank when it is on fire. You're not allowed to get off before that, only when the tank is on fire. Most of the wounds suffered inside a tank are burns because of the fuel tank. If it gets hit full on, the tank catches fire immediately. And then there's only one thing you can do. Get out as fast as you can. We sat inside the tank and counted 22 hits on our tank. It's not very enjoyable. The only feeling you have is, am I going to survive this? Finally, the 22nd hit went into the hull of the tank where the fuel canisters were. When the fuel tank got hit, that's when it caught fire and we were allowed to get out.
By the evening of December 22nd, the German push to the Meuse River bridges has almost completely halted. Panzer columns clog the narrow Ardennes roads, and many tanks run out of fuel. The Germans now turn their attention back to Bastogne. But the Americans in the encircled town are getting help. 3 combat commands of General Patton's 4th Armored Division move north to break the German blockade.
We were almost halfway to Bastogne, and we reached a place called Verdun. And by the time we reached the bridge, it was getting late in the afternoon. The bridge was blown. The river was cold, raging. In no way could the tanks ford them, so we had to stop and put in a bridge. Now, our tanks were firing at the enemy across the river, and they was firing at us. So once we felt it was safe enough, the engineers came in and we put in the bridge, mostly under cover of darkness. And our tanks started crossing the bridge. One tank, one tank, one tank. And then we were ready to rest for the night. I got word, no, keep moving. Patton said, I want them to move. Now here were the exhausted men. Now they were told to fight all night. And finally, at about first light, we reached the outskirts of Chaumont. Suddenly, seemingly out of nowhere, came a shot. Saw 3 jeeps from the 25th Cavalry hit. I immediately stopped my force. They must be down there in strength. I think I've got to have a planned operation.
It's a pincer maneuver that splits his force into 3 units. The tanks of C Company will attack from the west, while A Company attacks from the ridge east of the village. With his flanks protected, Erzik will drive his B Company down the main road and right into the center of Chaumont.
Now, if I were at Fort Knox, Kentucky, taking a tactics course, I probably would have gotten an A for my plan. But as you know, in combat, there are imponderables of the battlefield. C Company reports to me that 5 of his tanks, its first platoon, was completely bogged down. This ground was supposed to be frozen, so right away I knew C Company was of no help. So B Company started to advance down the town. We were hitting resistance, but it was not major resistance. The 10th Armored Infantry was working with us. As we got down into town, they would go into the buildings, around the buildings where the German soldiers were. B Company gets through the town, and at that point, the heavens open up and all hell breaks loose. We're suddenly hit all at once by direct fire. Now it's a matter of survival.
Erzik and his men have driven into an ambush and now face the most lethal tank killer in the German arsenal. A massive self-propelled gun called the Jag Tiger. The Battle of the Bulge enters its 7th bloody day. Elements of the 5th Panzer Army have driven 80 kilometers into Belgium and encircled the key Allied-held town of Bastogne. General George Patton sends the 4th Armored Division to break the siege. And on the morning of December 23rd, Lieutenant Colonel Albin Erzik leads his tanks into the village of Chaumont, 12 kilometers south of Bastogne.
So B Company started to advance down the town. And at that point, the heavens open up and all hell breaks loose. Just cannot describe the chaos that's there. It was a platoon of 4 Tiger Jags.
The Jag Tiger is a self-propelled tank killer, a 71-ton armored beast with a 128mm cannon that can tear open a Sherman more than 3.5 kilometers away.
There's tanks being hit, bang, 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 all over the place. B Company is downtown, and you can't turn in town, so we're very vulnerable. So I told my driver to start backing up. Now he's backing up blind. He needs some help from me. So as we moved back out, I had the turret turned. So I could see the road, and I'm directing the driver. So that means the back of the turret is toward the enemy, which makes it very, very vulnerable. And I began to breathe a little easier when it seemed like we were out of range. When suddenly I heard this loud, screeching, horrible sound just for an instant. And the tank was pushed forward as though some sledgehammer hit it in. 128, which should have breezed through the turret like a butter knife through butter, but it must have hit the ricochet up. So I told the driver, keep going. As we were moving back, I noticed there was a seam in the tank turret with daylight showing. So I knew something had hit the turret. And we finally pulled the tank out of range. I asked myself the question, why are we still here? Why did my tank survive this battle when I had this terrible, terrible blow? Next to the antenna well was something. It was an object. And to this day, I don't know why it was there. And the only thing I can conclude is that it must have hit this appendage and ricocheted off. I feel it was an absolute miracle that I survived that battle and I'm still here.
At the Battle of Chaumont, Combat Command B loses 18 tanks and most of their crews. The Germans and their deadly Jag Tigers have stalled Colonel Erzig's drive to Bastogne. "12 kilometers to the southeast, tanks of the Combat Command Reserve move towards Bougainville. Their mission is to take the heavily defended town and protect the flank of units advancing towards Bastogne. En route, they encounter a German patrol.
But we made our approach into Bougainville, and I pulled our tank up behind the railroad track. Momentarily, here came a Sherman tank and 2 German SPs. They captured an American Sherman and painted out our stars and painted on their cross. And when I came up behind the railroad track, my hull was in defilade. Defilade, the tank comes up from the rear, and as it approaches up, its gun points over the hill. That's called hull defilade because the hull is not seen by the enemy. The gunner's periscope was about 14 inches higher than the tube. The gun was looking at the track. The sight was above the track. So when he fired, he hit the first rail. And I said, push up a little bit, and he pushed up a little bit more, fired again, hit the second rail. I said, push up further. Yeah, roger. So I pushed it up enough that I got beyond the track, and we got a shell into the Sherman tank. And I also added another shell to each of these SPs.
With the German patrol outside Bougainville eliminated, Captain Leach leads his B company into the center of the town.
So our approach in every village, we would recon by fire with the bow gun shooting one direction and the coax machine gun shooting another on the side of the roads. So we were an avalanche of fire, movement, fire and movement. We fought in the hatch open mode, so you could see the targets, quickly. With the periscope, you're limited. You're blind except for where you're looking. And where your eye is like this, you can move your head back and forth and see targets. So we could engage quickly, but the enemy could also engage us quickly because we're exposing ourselves. So we had a lot of injured tank commanders as a result of fighting unbuttoned. Our infantry had failed to clear out all the houses. The German soldiers were still in some of these houses. But my tanks were all over the streets. And moments later, I'm hit. The bullet went into the helmet, as you see right here. It cut the sweatband off of my head, and this I had underneath. And here is where the bullet hit my head, and knocked me out. So I passed out and fell into the turret floor. They jokingly said, "Captain, get your butt back in the turret, you got work to do." Well, I did have work to do.
In 16 hours, the CCR takes Bougainville. And on December 24th, General Patton orders them to join the main attack towards Bastogne, and they spend Christmas Day moving west. Finally, on December 26th, the tanks of the Combat Command Reserve are poised to launch one of the most daring armored charges in the history of tank warfare. December 26, 1944. The Belgian town of Bastogne has been under siege for 5 days. Just south of town, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division CCR prepare to make one last attack against the German line and finally relieve the besieged Bastogne.
I led the attack that day, and Abrams joins me on position. Well, he said, "I'm going to run RC Company, Bogus, and pass through you straight ahead and go to Assenois and try to link up with the 101st Airborne to make that final breakthrough into Bastogne."
Lieutenant Charles Bogus leads 8 Sherman tanks into the heavily defended town of Assenois.
Bogus led the attack through here, and he had an armored infantry company with him, and they were busy fighting Germans who were resisting, trying to mine the road, and the artillery had knocked out several half-tracks, and mortar shells had knocked out several vehicles.
The German fire is intense, but Bogus and his men push right through it and advance down the final stretch of road leading to Bastogne.
It was quite a fight, really. I could hear it all shooting up ahead of me because Abrams left me in position there at Clochemont Hill.
The half-track in the column is destroyed by a German mine. Bogus pushes on with 2 other tanks and reaches the outskirts of Bastogne. There he encounters the final line of German defense, and Bogus and his wingman fire 3 rounds into it. The last obstacle on the road to Bastogne is eliminated. Moments later, men of the 101st Airborne emerge from the trees.
Bogus saw what looked like American uniform and hollered, "This is 4th Armored, come on out." And hesitatingly, the Americans commenced to then showing themselves.
The siege of Bastogne is broken. But for the 4th Armored Division, the cost of relieving the town has been steep. In just 10 days of combat, over 1,000 men are killed or wounded. And they lose 28 tanks. But their efforts mark the turning point in the Battle of the Bulge. The weather clears, and for the next 21 days, American tanks, now supported by airstrikes, force the Germans out of the Ardennes.
Once the weather cleared up and the sun was shining, they were able to deploy the artillery and air force and stabbed us in the back.
Durchstoß gegeben.
The fighter bombers were dangerous for us. On one tank, believe it or not, we counted 500 hits from a machine gun. We couldn't compete with that. And shortly after Christmas, we barely had any tanks left. And I thought, for God's sake, they have a lot of equipment than us with our tiny amount of tanks. At the end of 44, beginning of 45, we had no further supply. We had no further equipment to fight with.
The Battle of the Bulge, the largest battle on the Western Front, ends on January 12, 1945. The casualties on both sides are enormous. More than 90,000 German soldiers are killed, wounded, or captured. Almost 20,000 Americans die, and 50,000 are wounded. It's their bloodiest battle of the war. The Americans lose over 320 tanks, but the Germans' final gamble has cost more. They lose more than 500 irreplaceable panzers and will never launch another offensive.
Sitting here now, looking back, unbelievable. I can't believe I was there. I can't believe I did what I did. It's a very strange feeling. It was the lead element of Patton's army. It was the force that was successful in breaking the siege of Bastogne. I firmly believe that was the turning point of the Battle of the Bulge. And the Battle of the Bulge was the turning point of the war in Europe.
May 1940. Thousands of German tanks strike deep into Belgium, Holland, and France. And a new era in armored warfare begins. This is blitzkrieg.
Move fast, hit hard, move fast again.
The Allies, stunned by the speed of the attack, send thousands of their own tanks to meet the advancing panzers.
Once that armor starts rolling, it's damn difficult to stop it.
For the first time in history, two giant armored forces clash. It becomes one of the greatest tank battles of the Second World War.
There was fire everywhere, huge fireballs. We were absolutely blinded.
At stake is nothing less than the fate of Western Europe.
The situation is now absolutely desperate.
This is the Battle of France. Sedan, France, on the Meuse River near the Belgian border. This pleasant rural countryside is dotted with crumbling concrete bunkers. Stark reminders of Europe's dark past, a time when the entire world teetered on the brink of disaster. September 1st, 1939. A German army, 1.5 million men strong, streams across the border into Poland. And the Second World War begins. Already, Hitler's forces have annexed or conquered large swaths of Eastern Europe. In the spring of 1940, he turns his attention to the West. But the Western Allies are ready. Since the fall of Poland, France and Britain have been building defensive fortifications, stockpiling ammunition, and massing men and machines in Western Europe. The Allies believe they are ready for the inevitable German invasion. By May of 1940, they field almost 3.5 million men, 14,000 artillery pieces, and 3,600 armored vehicles. A formidable defensive force that outnumbers and outguns the Germans. For their invasion, Germany has assembled 2.4 million men, more than 7,500 artillery guns, and only 2,500 tanks. Under conventional military doctrine, the attacker should always be stronger than the defender, but the German plan is anything but conventional. Their plan calls for 10 panzer divisions to charge west across a 400-kilometer front. with the main attack driving through the Ardennes Forest. Their goal, surprise, divide, and destroy the Allies. The hilly, rugged Ardennes is considered poor terrain for tanks. Here, heavy armor can get bogged down in the deep woods and gullies. It's one of the most unlikely places for a panzer attack, and for that reason, it's perfect.
At no point the French High Command was prepared to suffer an attack in the Ardennes.
The speed and ferocity of the German attack catches the Allies off guard. Still clinging to military tactics of the First World War, they are ill-prepared for General Heinz Guderian's new form of mobile armored warfare, the blitzkrieg.
Guderian and all the young panzer generals, they understood that speed and mobility and confusion are the key elements of this strategy. Creating a center of gravity, breaking through, piercing through it, then break out and create confusion and terror so the enemy's army collapses.
More than 1,700 panzers cross the Ardennes with shocking speed. They cover 100 kilometers of difficult terrain in less than 3 days. And by May 13th, are only 300 kilometers from the English Channel. Reeling from the German attack, the Allies send all available forces east to intercept the Germans near the Meuse River.
We receive urgent orders to rush forward and counterattack the Germans that had crossed the Meuse. We had to stop them and throw them back across the river to the other side.
Spearheading the Allied counterattack and rushing headlong into the rapidly advancing panzers are 36 French light tanks. The FCM-36 is well protected by 40 millimeters of frontal armor. But its short-barreled 37mm main gun is designed primarily for infantry support and is all but useless against Guderian's tanks.
All of a sudden, we saw clouds of dust. We were surprised that it was German armor. It wasn't just 2 or 3. It was more like dozens of panzers, and they were armed with cannons, with long barrels.
Advancing towards the French are dozens of the formidable Panzer Mark III. It is armed with a long-barreled 37mm cannon, giving the Mark III much more killing power than the French tanks.
We take the shell, we put it in the cannon, we aim, and we fire. We don't have time to think. But we couldn't pierce their armor. I saw some of my comrades get hit first. They were dead without being able to do anything. It's awful to think that there's nothing you can do to help them. But they just couldn't defend themselves against the larger and more powerful German cannons.
The FCM-36 were no match for the Panzers. The main drawback was armament, which was a short gun, which was almost useless against German armor.
Ne pouvait percer aucun blindage.
Our short cannon could not pierce their armor. All we could do is try to blind the drivers of the panzers in front of us. It wasn't easy to aim. We were raising the cannon up and down with our shoulder to pick the area we wanted to hit. But we somehow managed. We don't even think if we're going to make it or not. We have to do what we can with what we have. That's all. If we get killed, then so be it. When shells hit our armor, the steel turns bright red. Inside the tank, shards of metal would fly out, pieces that were red hot and piercing. When we see a tank burning with shell holes and the crew inside, it hurts. We feel it and we try to avenge them. While I was looking, a German shell hit our turret. It didn't go through, but it shattered the periscope and it fell on me, knocking me out. My tank was the last to be knocked out. Of the 39 tanks that set out that morning at 11:30, only 10 remained. But we stopped the Germans. That was our goal.
Despite their losses, the French tanks slow the German advance, forcing Guderian to change his plans. He decides to bypass the French defenders to the south and continue his lightning attack west. But as the German blitzkrieg cuts a narrow swath westward, its flank becomes increasingly extended and poorly defended. The French realize that this is just the break they need and send 2 battalions of their heaviest tanks straight into the vulnerable German flank. May 10th, 1940. Determined to dominate Western Europe, Hitler launches a massive blitzkrieg into Holland, Belgium, and France.
The blitzkrieg, from a German point of view, was just the war of movement. They always tried to move fast, hit hard, move fast again. And create confusion and terror in the backland of the enemy, so the enemy's army collapses.
In just 3 days, the Germans advance more than 100 kilometers through the Ardennes Forest. And the Allies, caught off guard, send all available forces east to meet the onslaught. Although their light tanks are outgunned and they sustain heavy losses, the French manage to blunt the German attack, forcing them to change their plans and proceed with their advance to the west. Guderian's panzers cut a 30-kilometer swath deep into France, but at a cost. His flanks are now overextended and vulnerable. On May 15th, the French attack the Germans' left flank, aiming to capture the strategic high ground at the French village of Stone.
The small village of Stone was crucial. It was crucial for the Germans to hold it, to secure their bridgehead, and also their move westwards.
For this critical battle, the French have deployed 68 of their most formidable weapon, the heavy Char B1-Bis tank.
The most feared Allied tanks for the Germans, I think the most feared is the French Char B1, a massive bulking tank with 60 millimeters of armor. The Char B was the nightmare of the German tank crews.
Les jours de combat, il faisait très beau.
The day of the battle was very nice. It was ideal for us. We had great visibility from our tanks. We could see far into the fields. We had to go into Bastogne on a scouting mission. But we didn't have a radio at the time, so we were on our own. We not only had to fight the Germans, but we had to prevent them from getting past us. Going up the hill, we didn't see anything. No sign or contact with the enemy. As we continued to advance, we still didn't see the enemy. So we had to keep our guard up while we moved forward. We first made contact when German machine guns on the water tower opened fire and started shooting at us. The Germans put a machine gun on the water tower. They were shooting at us and pinning down our soldiers. We had to fire our 75mm at the water tower. So I drove up to get closer. I had to get into position to fire on the machine gun nest, so we could knock it out. We just had to eliminate them and move on. I kept driving the tank. We had to advance and keep engaging the enemy, so I was shooting the 75mm cannon. We had to take that position and keep that hill.
As the big French tanks reach Bastogne, they come under heavy fire from well-hidden German anti-tank guns.
Inside the Charbet, we were very confident that our strong armor would keep us safe from danger or injury.
Nicknamed the Colossus, the Charbet-1 is protected by 60mm of frontal armor, making it virtually impregnable. Combined with its incredible firepower, the Charbet-1 is the most powerful tank on the battlefield. And the deadliest foe of the German anti-tank gunners.
The fire from 3 heavy enemy tanks threatened to wipe out the platoon. At one point, one of the giants stood sideways. Our left gun commander spotted a small ribbed surface in the middle of the enemy tank side. Apparently a kind of radiator. He aimed at it. A jet of flame shot out of the tank. Now the 2 field guns fired only at those little squares in the side of the 32-ton enemy tanks.
At that moment, I decided to release a smoke shell so we could escape from there. Coming out of the smoke, there was an anti-tank gun right in front of us. He was getting ready to fire at me, but he didn't have time. I was too close and I couldn't fire. There was only one thing to do. I had to drive my tank over it. The crew of the anti-tank gun were raising their hands. I couldn't fire at them, so the tank commander took care of them. We left the village and went back to our base, lucky to be in one piece.
The French flanking attack at Bastogne fails, and Guderian's panzers continue to push through the Ardennes, virtually unchecked. To Guderian's north, at the spearhead of the German advance, is the elite 7th Panzer Division, led by Germany's most famous Panzer commander, Erwin Rommel. By May 14th, Rommel and his tanks reach the Belgian village of Favion. their last obstacle before the flat, open country leading to the English Channel. If they can break out here, Rommel's highly mobile panzers will be just a few days from the coast, threatening to split the Allied armies in half. May 15th, 1940. It's been 5 days since the beginning of Hitler's invasion of France, and his mighty panzer divisions have already bludgeoned their way 150 kilometers through the rugged Ardennes. Repeated attempts by French armor have failed to stop the German blitzkrieg, and they're now 250 kilometers short of their objectives along the English Channel. Leading the way is Erwin Rommel's mighty 7th Panzer Division, who are on the verge of breaking out of the Ardennes and into the panzer-friendly Belgian flatlands. In desperation, the French rush 170 tanks of their powerful 1st Armored Division north to head Rommel off near the Belgian village of Flavion. But the French advance is slowed by tens of thousands of refugees who choke the roads and block their path.
We had to cross a crowd of refugees. It took us 5 hours to cover just 5 kilometers. The fields were filled with a crowd that was completely lost and insane.
Bit by bit, the French managed to push through the human chaos and finally reach Flavion. The French tankers are exhausted and now critically short on fuel. As the French rest and wait for resupply, they are spotted by the 7th Panzer's advance guard. It's more than Rommel could have hoped for. Before him, and completely unaware of his presence, lies the French 1st Armored Division. Rommel splits his panzer force in two and moves them into position on either side of the oblivious French tanks. His deadly trap is now set.
Any encounter between German and Allied tanks has got to have been a surprise, and usually the result of those battles, as much as anything else, is just like a Western gunfight. It's the guy who keeps his cool and gets his shot off first.
Hits ring against the armor on the left side. My driver shouts, "There's a tank by the edge of this wood." I realize then that the whole of our left flank is packed with German tanks.
What the Germans did was to build circles around them, move around them and shoot on them from every side. The German tanks tried to act like wolf packs. They tried to get around isolated Charbillon, which was quite easy because the Allied tanks were scattered along the battlefield, so they picked one out, already using the radio to, let's say, let's pick this one on the right half, first tanks. So all the tanks were concentrating on this one lonely Charbillon.
Surprised and low on fuel, the scattered French tanks are all but helpless against the Panzer ambush.
After some minutes of battle, each French tank was fighting for itself. And at most for the tank on his left and the tank on his right.
Red flashes and a crash on our armor. One shot strikes the side door, which bangs open, half mangled.
Imagine, you are a tank commander. You are alone in your turret. You have to lead your tank. You also have to man your gun. You have to sight. You have to choose your enemy. You have to fire, and you have to do everything. You are like a tambourine man inside a coffin of steel.
In the French tank, the man in the turret was just seeing through this slit, this view hole, and he was seeing just rotating tanks around him. And he couldn't revolve the turret just to keep track with one, not to speak of 5 or 6 or 7.
One hits into our radiator, another shell strikes our 75mm gun, jamming it. The noise is deafening as we're hit from all sides, but we keep firing with the 47mm cannon.
When you confuse the enemy tank crew enough, and if you shoot enough, sometimes you will hit the tracks, you will hit something vulnerable, or they simply will give up under the pressure.
My right track is rattling furiously, and my 47mm gun has been worked so hard that the bolt could not be closed, so we withdraw slowly.
The German tanks would find a weak spot, would take them out somehow, and then concentrate on the next. Like animals jumping from one point to the other, like really the predatory animals on the next victim.
L'Avion is a terrible place for the French tank force. The division was completely smashed up. It was unable of any other action.
Rommel's attack destroys 2 entire tank battalions. And by the end of the day, the French 1st Armored Division, originally 170 tanks strong, is reduced to just 36. The victory at Flavion allows the Germans to break out of the rugged terrain of the Ardennes and into the tank-friendly country of Western Belgium. And they advance to the sea at full speed. Allied command scrambles to mount another counterattack against the ever-lengthening German flank. And now the stakes are even higher. If the blitzkrieg can't be stopped, all of Western Europe will be lost. May 1940. Allied armies fight to stop the German invasion of Western Europe, but it's a losing cause. After almost obliterating the French 1st Armored Division at Flavion, General Erwin Rommel's panzers break out into the open country of Western France and Belgium and race almost unopposed towards the English Channel. The French High Command, desperate to stem the German onslaught, quickly tries to reorganize their armored forces at Stone. Their mission is to slice through the German southern flank and cut their lines of communication and supply. But 5 days of constant German attacks have taken a heavy toll on the French. Their army is racked by severe disorganization, and at the last minute they call off the attack. But in the confusion, the message doesn't reach the 49th Tank Battalion. And on May 15th at 5:30 p.m., without artillery or infantry support, they begin their advance towards the German line.
With our 5 tanks, we emerged from the woods. We were surprised by an artillery barrage. But we had to go through it, although we couldn't see. There was fire everywhere, like huge fireballs and huge chunks of earth. We were absolutely blinded by it all. We got beaten up. We had to look for a way out. So at that moment, we began to assemble into line formation and throw ourselves into the attack. Having just made it through the barrage, we immediately came under fire by anti-tank guns.
The French have driven straight into a trap. A V-shaped killing zone where German anti-tank guns are positioned to catch the advancing tanks in a deadly crossfire.
When an anti-tank gun fires at you, it makes a deafening noise. And when it hits, it leaves a mark inside the tank. It creates a weird effect. What I was afraid of is all the fuel we had inside at the time. We had 400 liters of gasoline. Never mind the 80 shells inside. If ever there was a fire or a spark in there, the tank becomes a bomb. I got hit 17 times from the anti-tank guns. 12 on the right and 5 on the front. When an anti-tank gun fires at you, it creates a long flame. So I was able to detect them like that. When I saw a flame, I turned around because I wanted to aim where it was coming from. They couldn't turn and run away. So I aimed and fired. I destroyed 3 anti-tank guns. We turned and saw the captain of our company 10 meters in front of us. His tank had gone down a ravine and got stuck in a stream. The driver was killed by a shell that went through his hatch. It's very different when you have comrades that are injured. It changes everything. So we tried to save as many as we could. We turned around and there was another tank commander. He gave us a sign that his driver was severely injured. We drove closer and brought them into our tank. We wound up with 9 people in the tank, being stuck like sardines. At that moment, I couldn't fight anymore. With the recoil of the gun, I couldn't fire. So I drove to the forest to bring the wounded to the ambulance.
The French attack fails, and the German blitzkrieg continues rolling west towards the sea. The formidable panzer columns now seem unstoppable.
The Germans, they were always up there, they were always pushing, they were always scaring people, and you never quite knew how and where to react to that. Once that armour starts rolling, it's damn difficult to stop it.
On May 20th, 10 days after the invasion began, the vanguard of Guderian's panzers reaches the English Channel at Abbeville, France, and cuts the Allied forces in half. The situation for the Allies is dire. They must relink their armies before the Germans can bring up reinforcements. And they prepare for one last do-or-die attack. It will be the decisive tank-on-tank clash in the Battle of France. May 20th, 1940. The German blitzkrieg into Western Europe enters its 10th bloody day. The vanguard of Guderian's tank force reaches the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in half. But the Germans' speedy advance has left them a thin and weakly defended panzer corridor. And hoping to exploit this, the Allies mount one last assault, aimed at smashing through the German flanks. The plan, a pincer movement near the city of Arras, with British tanks attacking from the north and the French from the south. But the plan falls apart when the French army, fatally weakened by 10 days of continuous fighting, fails to reach Arras in time for the attack. Without the French, the Allied tank force is reduced by almost half, leaving them with only 2,000 men, 48 field guns, and 88 tanks. It is a small force, easily outmatched by the tanks of Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. But the Allies realize time is running out, and despite the heavy odds against them, they launch their attack.
I was stopped at a little village just outside Arras to join the tanks that were already out there. We had about 5 or 6 Matildas then, so we set off. We just kept going as fast as we could. We were told to shoot to kill.
The Matilda II is equipped with a 2-pounder cannon, capable of destroying German armor at a range of 1,500 meters. But its most impressive feature is its 78 millimeters of frontal armor, making the Matilda II the best protected tank on the battlefield.
The tank that was costing the most nerve on the German side was the Matilda. It wasn't fast, its gun wasn't so impressive, but the thick armor was impenetrable for everything the Germans had. The main anti-tank gun on the German side was a 37mm anti-tank gun. This proved so ineffective that it was called Army Knocking Machine. So because it didn't anything but knock knock and then the tank drove on, so that was the nickname for this gun.
With no way to stop them, the Matildas overrun German positions, sending panic through the lines. With his forces wavering and in retreat, Rommel rushes to Arras to take personal command.
We arrived at WWII. The enemy tank fire had created chaos and confusion among our troops. We drove off to a hill west of the village, where we found a light anti-aircraft troop and several anti-tank guns located in a small wood. At the same time, several enemy tanks were advancing down the road. It was an extremely tight spot.
May 21st, 1940. In a do-or-die bid to stop the Nazi invasion of Western Europe, the British attacked German positions in the French city of Arras.
We just kept going as fast as we could. We were told to shoot to kill.
British Matilda II heavy tanks lead the attack and easily eliminate the lighter German armor. Desperate to prevent a British breakthrough, Rommel deploys his 88mm anti-aircraft guns in a defensive line and orders them to fire at the advancing Matildas.
Every gun was ordered to open rapid fire immediately. I personally gave each gun its target.
When they brought the 88mm, they would go through any tank.
The German 88mm Flak 18 gun was designed as a long-range anti-aircraft weapon. And when used against tanks, this high-velocity cannon can easily penetrate the thickest Allied armor, even at ranges of over 1 kilometer.
So that was the only time I was pretty frightened.
With the enemy tanks so perilously close, only rapid fire from every gun could save the situation. We ran from gun to gun. The objections of the gun commanders, that their range was still too great to engage the tanks effectively, were overruled. All I cared about was to halt the enemy tanks by heavy gunfire.
Well, we could see the German tanks on the horizon, and as soon as they saw us, they started firing at us, as you see. One or two of our tanks got blown up, you see, just like that. I can see him now, one of the tanks, backing up this road and shooting with his machine guns. Then, that was it.
Soon we succeeded in putting the enemy tanks out of action. We now directed our fire against another group of tanks attacking. Setting fire to some, halting others, and forcing the rest to retreat.
I had a mate killed in one. He wanted to have his head shot off. Tank commander, open visor, blown his head off. So that was a bit sickening then.
Although we were under very heavy fire from the tanks during this action, the gun crews worked magnificently.
So that was retreat, right, retreat. That was the only where we got retreat. Well, we couldn't, there's nothing else we could do.
Rommel's victory at Arras is hard won. The Germans have sustained their heaviest casualties of the campaign, losing 30 panzers and more than 600 men. But the British have suffered far worse. Just 28 of the original 88 tanks make it back to their lines, and hundreds of men are killed and wounded.
After Arras, and after the fighting in Western France, we have lost virtually all our tanks, all our anti-tank guns. As far as Britain itself is concerned, the situation is now absolutely desperate.
German divisions reach the coast, and by June 4th, the last British troops evacuate France at Dunkirk. Three weeks later, France surrenders. The quick and decisive German victory is a testament to the power of blitzkrieg. And most crucial to their success are their mighty panzer formations.
In 1940, the tank has come of age. The tank is now the leading player in the ground war. It's what brings France to her knees and kicks Britain out of France so quickly.
A huge number of soldiers have lost their lives for the defense of France, especially in the tank forces. All the men have fought fiercely with hope that their action would stop the enemy.
Nous avons perdu la bataille de France. C'est très simple.
We lost the Battle of France. We were simply overwhelmed by the enemy's equipment. We had nothing to go against this mass. Losing war is one thing. Losing hope is another.
The fall of France is considered one of the greatest military victories of all time. With it, Hitler achieves what most thought impossible: total Nazi domination of Europe. September 1944. After months of vicious fighting, tanks from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division reach the frontier of Nazi Germany, confident the war is in its final days.
The Allies did think that the war was going to be over by Christmas.
But German forces put up a furious defense of the fatherland.
And they just picked off our tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4, just like they were in a shooting gallery.
Against battle-hardened opponents, the Americans quickly learned that invading Germany will be a long and bloody campaign.
The army was fighting to stop the enemy from entering the fatherland.
As both sides roll out their newest armored titans in the battle for Germany.
The tank that we got into was that one-of-a-kind tank.
It was a fight right on to the very end.
Western Germany, near the border with Belgium. In the closing months of World War II, this was a scene of intense fighting as Allied forces battled their way into the fatherland, mile by bloody mile. Since the D-Day landings in June of 1944, American, British, and Canadian tanks have overwhelmed the Germans occupying France. Throughout the summer months, fierce armored battles steadily pushed the enemy back.
The German withdrawal was very chaotic. The Germans referred to it as the void. There was a lack of communication. Units were fighting in isolation. It was very difficult. They all knew that they had to go towards Germany to find safety.
And by September, the Allies are nearing the German frontier. The attack into Germany will be spearheaded by the U.S. 3rd Armored Division. The first obstacle they face is a series of defensive fortifications known as the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, that the Germans have built along the border.
Siegfried Line was similar to the Maginot Line that France had built. They would have had a number of bunkers, a lot of established fortifications that were there to turn certain areas into kill zones.
Though it looks impressive, with hundreds of kilometers of anti-tank barriers known as Dragon's Teeth, advanced scouts from the 3rd Armored Division discover weak spots in the line. Then they come up with a simpler way to get through the German defenses.
They brought up bulldozers and bulldozed dirt up over the Siegfried Line so the other tanks and trucks and everything else could run up over the top of it just to push more material and more people into Germany. My tank was back about 8 tanks. We weren't being shot at the moment, so I could take my periscope and look around and see what was going on. I could see the dragon's teeth and that sort of thing, so I knew we were going on by them. We thought once we got through the Siegfried Line, you know, they'd say, well, you know, they're inside, we might as well quit.
The Allies did think that the war was going to be over by Christmas. A lot of them did, at least.
They are the first invading army to cross the German frontier in force since the age of Napoleon. So the Americans are uncertain of how the enemy will fight. By late 1944, much of Germany lies in ruins. Its cities have been bombed relentlessly, its armed forces decimated. Now, to finish the war and put an end to Hitler's Third Reich, the Americans assemble a massive invasion force from the U.S. First Army, with 100,000 combat soldiers, hundreds of artillery guns, and more than 1,200 tanks, including 850 of their armored workhorse, the Sherman. The M4A1 has a short-barreled, low-velocity 75mm main gun, with an effective range of just 800 meters. And with only 51 millimeters of frontal armor, it's vulnerable to German high-velocity cannons.
All the way through training, I was just impressed with this tank. You know, it was 32 tons of steel. It would go about 30 miles an hour. You could crank it up. You know, inside, you felt like you were really secure.
The Allied plan has British and Canadian forces pushing towards northern Germany, while the Americans take the southern route. The 3rd Armored Division is ordered to advance along the open corridor south of Aachen, the first city over the border.
That was a supposedly easy route to cross the Ruhr River, get to the Rhine, and then establish crossings, and then from there it was, you know, going to be the end.
At a road junction, tanks from E Company halt as their commander decides which way to go.
They told you in basic training 1,000,000 times, don't stop at T intersections. Because the Germans always have it zeroed in. But I had to get out and smoke a cigarette, and sure enough, while they're trying to decide where to go, right or left out of that intersection, the Germans dropped in a whole bunch of artillery shells. My tank commander screamed at me to get back in the tank, which I did in a hurry, and then off we went. For a moment, there was, you know, almost a panic. You know, where else are they?
The Americans have run into forward units of the German 9th Panzer Division.
The army was fighting to stop the enemy from entering the Fatherland.
They were defending Germany. They weren't Nazis at this point. I mean, you're defending your homeland. You've got an invader coming in, and that's where the buck stops, at the border.
The Americans quickly move on, away from the enemy guns, and continue their advance. 2 platoons of tanks from E Company approach a small town. This time, they are more cautious and split their forces in 2.
There was a small town. It had houses only on both sides of the road. Behind this row of houses, there was a hill, and on this side, there was a big open field and then a slag pile from the coal mine. 4 tanks went on the outside of those houses. The 4 tanks that I was with went right up through the middle of town. So we were all just really alert.
But the Germans have anticipated this American tactic.
And all of a sudden, you heard firing and you heard screaming and yelling. And the Germans had anti-tank guns dug into that slag pile.
Targeting the Americans is the deadliest anti-tank gun of the war, the German 88. The 88-millimeter gun has armor-piercing shells that can penetrate 100 millimeters of steel at distances of up to 1,500 meters. More than enough power to penetrate the frontal armor of a Sherman tank.
The one that everybody talked about was the German 88. It had a very high muzzle velocity, so their trajectory was almost flat. And they just picked off our tanks, 1, 2, 3, 4. Just like they were in a shooting gallery. So my tank, we stopped hiding behind a house. And then they said, okay, back out of town. So we turned around and went back out of town.
Half of E Company's tanks are destroyed in a matter of minutes. And the 3rd Armored Division's advance is slow. Fighting along Germany's western border is proving costly for the Americans. The 3rd Armored Division began their advance to Germany with 400 tanks. But enemy resistance has left them with less than 100 tanks that are operational, and they still have 650 kilometers between them and Berlin. October 1944. Fresh U.S. reinforcements arrive, and the American 3rd Armored Division prepares to resume its assault on Germany. But the fighting near the border has delayed their advance and allowed the Germans to bolster their defenses. The first city inside Germany that the Allies plan to seize is Aachen.
The Allies went through the Aachen area because it was considered a route through the heavily forested, heavily mountainous area of Western Germany. That area, if it were under Allied control, would have allowed the funneling of resources relatively easily into the Rhineland and central Germany.
Most of its civilian population has been evacuated, and the Germans have created fortified positions throughout the city, as well as on the approach routes. For the defense of Aachen, the Germans have 18,000 troops, 240 artillery guns, and nearly 60 tanks and assault guns. Hitler also calls up some 5,000 members of the local militia, the Volkssturm. Made up of boys and men aged from 16 to 60, they are poorly trained and only lightly armed. And Hitler gives the order that all of Aachen's defenders must stand firm against the Americans or die at their posts.
We could not retreat, not even a meter. We had to hold our position, and if we did not, we knew we would be shot. That is why we endured all this.
The Americans have assembled 80,000 troops and more than 300 tanks for their assault. They plan to encircle Aachen. The 2nd Armored Division will attack from north of the city, while the 3rd Armored attacks from the south. Shermans from the 3rd Armored Division's 33rd Armored Regiment are ordered to proceed towards Aachen. But first, they must face the battle-hardened veterans of the 116th Panzer Division.
They were good fighters. Some of them been fighting for years, fighting the Russians, and now they brought them back from that front and put them in this front. And they fought to the last man, to keep you out.
The terrain south of Aachen provides a defending army with many positions from which to ambush attackers. The Americans advance cautiously, unsure of where or when they may meet the tanks of the 116th. The Panzer IV is the most widely used tank in the German arsenal. It is armed with a high-velocity 75mm gun and boasts 80mm of frontal armor, more than the Sherman. But its sides are vulnerable to the American tank, having only 30mm of armor.
You were hoping you didn't have to have a battle with them head-on. What we were trying to hit was the side of them. To hit them front-on was a waste of your ammunition. You had to get them from the side. The tactic was to get somebody over here to start shooting at the German tank. And in order for him to shoot at this tank, he had to maneuver his tank around to get some protection. And when he maneuvered his tank around, then somebody else on this side had a better shot.
side shot misses the Panzer IV. A Sherman approaches head-on, and the German crew capitalizes on this opportunity.
All of a sudden, a lieutenant showed up, Lieutenant Baer, and told my tank commander to get out, that he was going to take over that tank. Lieutenant Baer had lost 2 tanks that day already. When he got into my tank, he just stood there for a minute. And we looked at him, and the man was just completely battle fatigued, really. And all of a sudden, one of the other sergeants called over the radio and said, "Lieutenant, back up. They're shooting at you." When he said that, I turned my periscope around like this, and I saw a big fireball go by me. And then finally he reached up and he had to squeeze this little mic so he could talk. And he said, "Driver, back up." I could see the driver had it in reverse and was gunning the engine. And as soon as he said that, bang. Shell hit and went right through the gunner and right through the tank commander and killed them both instantly. The tank driver had gotten out, and so I dove out of the turret, down into the tank driver's seat, out over the side. And just as I went out over the side, the tank got hit the second time, and this time it started to burn and explode. We would have had 10 tanks, and we ended up after that battle with only 4.
The Americans fight their way into Aachen on the 13th of October. The Germans suffer 5,000 casualties and more than 5,000 captured trying to hold the city. But on October 21st, Aachen surrenders to the Americans, the first city in the fatherland to fall to the Allies. Now central Germany lies before the 3rd Armored Division.
The thought kept going through your mind, well, they'll quit now. When they didn't, that was what really came as a surprise.
In November, American troops encounter some of their worst combat of the war in the Ardennes Forest southeast of Aachen. With their troops tired from months of fighting, their invasion of Germany stalls. A stalemate sets in on the front lines. The 3rd Armored Division works to repair damaged tanks and prepare for the next phase of the war. On December 16, 1944, it is the Germans who launch a massive armored offensive, taking the Allies by surprise. The Battle of the Bulge. The German plan is to slice through enemy lines and drive towards Antwerp, trapping more than 1 million Allied troops. But after 6 weeks of bitter fighting, the German offensive grinds to a halt, blunted by Allied reinforcements. Hitler's gamble proves costly, losing hundreds of much-needed panzers in the fighting.
After the Ardennes offensive, that essentially expended Germany's operational capacities on the Western Front. The remainder of it was defensive and reactionary as opposed to actually initiating and setting the tone for momentum or an attack.
As the Germans retreat in the west, the Soviet Union launches its own offensive on the Eastern Front. The Red Army smashes its way through German lines in the Balkans, East Prussia, and Poland. By early February, Soviet tanks are just 80 kilometers from Berlin. On the Western Front, the Allies now resume their invasion of Germany. Their first objective is to seize bridges over the Rhine River, the last natural barrier to central Germany. Tanks from the 1st Canadian Army are to advance through what's known as the Hochwald Gap and capture key bridges on the Rhine, near the German town of Xanten. But as the Canadians move into Germany, they must overcome fierce resistance.
You have to take into account, here's the Germans. Their very livelihood depends on preventing the Allies from seizing the bridges. If the Canadians seize the bridges, it's no time until they've surrounded the Ruhr and their lifeline is finished. And they were able to hold a force 5 times their size at bay for 31 days.
After weeks of intense combat, the Canadians overcome German resistance, and their armor finally reaches the Rhine River. And as they cross it and move deeper into Germany, they see the effect of the war on the civilian population.
We were approaching this small town. It was called Wesel. Prior to us arriving there, the British or Canadian Typhoon rocket plane came in with their rockets and strafed the town, and they just messed that town up terribly. And we were walking through the town at the time, and man, we couldn't believe it. Rubble on either side piled up. The homes are totally gone. What people were around, they had carts, and they were picking the bodies up and putting them in carts. The bodies looked like mannequins, you know, like a statue, like you see in the store. And they were all in the debris and everything else.
In the first 2 months of 1945, the Germans lose close to 1,000 tanks. Over 500,000 soldiers and civilians become casualties as they try to prevent total defeat.
A lot of the Germans that were coming up to the front were passing through a lot of the urbanized areas that had been bombed by the U.S. and Britain, and that added to their resolve. They'd seen what they'd done to civilians, they wanted a little payback, so some of these groups were motivated.
Aber bei vielen Kameraden,
my fellow soldiers, whose homes had been destroyed, they said, "What am I supposed to do at home? I would rather take another American with me to the grave."
nehme ich lieber noch ein paar Amis mit, so war der Ausdruck.
And it is German troops like these that the U.S. 3rd Armored Division must now face as they resume their advance. They are tasked with helping to capture the biggest Allied target in Western Germany, Cologne. By seizing this city on the Rhine River, the division can open a route into central Germany.
We knew that when we got back into combat, it was going to be to head towards Cologne. It was quite an objective, and the Germans didn't want to give it up. We had a real battle on our hands with the tanks.
The Americans will make a frontal assault on Cologne, Germany's 3rd largest city, with tanks leading the way. Cologne has been bombed repeatedly. Street after street lies in ruins, providing the defending German troops and their Panther and Tiger tanks countless number of positions from which to ambush the Americans.
There was so much bomb damage. The buildings were all collapsed, and the streets were very narrow, and we had obstacles all over. Everything was bombed, except the cathedral. That was good shape. I recall our lieutenant said, "Gentlemen, I give you Cologne. Let's knock the hell out of it." The Germans zeroed in on us with artillery. At first I thought they were bombing us. There was such big explosions all around.
The Sherman tanks are outgunned by Panther and Tiger tanks defending Cologne. But the Germans don't realize the Americans of the 3rd Armored Division will be attacking with a new weapon, the Pershing tank. The T-26E3 Pershing tank is America's answer to Germany's fearsome Tiger. This heavy tank boasts an impressive 100 millimeters of frontal armor and a lethal 90 millimeter main gun with a killing range of 1,500 meters. But the Pershing has not yet been tested in urban combat. On March 6, 1945, it gets its baptism of fire in the streets of Cologne.
We finally moved into this intersection. A German tank had come into the intersection to my left. And just far enough that he saw us and he backed away. I fired armor-piercing shells through the building. I figured maybe I will get a lucky hit. The top of the building collapsed and fell on top of the German tank. They couldn't turn their gun. They couldn't rotate the turret. There was so much rubble on there that they abandoned the tank and were captured.
The Americans continue to advance towards the city center. They are guided by the towers of the medieval Cathedral of St. Peter that loom over Cologne.
You could see that from a distance, you know. You see the spirals up from the top of the cathedral.
As they near it, the Americans' progress is hindered by a deadly enemy tank. The Panther is armed with a high-velocity 75 millimeter main gun, capable of hitting targets over 1,000 meters away. It has 80 millimeters of frontal armor, but sloped, this becomes effectively 145 millimeters of protection.
We headed down toward the cathedral. As we got closer, found that the German tank had fired from the plaza in front of the cathedral and knocked out one of our tanks. Our Sherman tanks were not very good. They were no match for the Panthers anyway.
The Americans bail out of their burning tank, but 3 of the 5 crew die. To defeat the enemy tank, the Pershing must outflank the Panther.
D Company radioed over to us and asked us to go down and get the German. Supposedly his gun's pointing toward them, not at us, you know. As we went into the intersection, the driver had his periscope turned, looking up toward the German tank. As he came into the intersection, he saw their gun coming around to meet us. And instead of stopping, he floored the throttle down and went roaring right out into the middle of the intersection.
Unlike its opponent, the Pershing is equipped with a gyro stabilizer, a device that allows the main gun to be fired with accuracy, even while the tank is in motion.
As soon as I could, I fired once, I hit him, and I fired again. And again, to make sure nobody was going to be firing back. After the third shot, they burst into flames.
The Panther tank burns for 2 days. By March 7th, the Americans mop up the last pockets of resistance, and Cologne's defenders surrender. March 7th is a fateful day for the Third Reich. The same day, Cologne is captured. A crucial bridge over the Rhine is seized at nearby Remagen. And American armor is soon pouring across it to the eastern side of the river, including tanks from the 3rd Armored Division.
When the fighting got closer and closer and reached the bridge at Remagen, we were thinking, it is over.
The 3rd Armored Division is now less than 600 kilometers from Berlin. But between them and the German capital is the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heartland. And 500,000 Nazi troops, determined to protect their nation at all cost. March 23rd, 1945. The Allies launched their offensive into the Ruhr region. The attack will be a classic pincer movement, with the 9th U.S. Army attacking from the north, and the 1st U.S. Army attacking from the south. If they succeed, over 350,000 soldiers from Germany's Army Group B will be trapped. But the Germans are led by one of the finest defensive commanders of the war, Field Marshal Walter Model. To defeat him, the Americans must destroy his panzer forces. So the 3rd Armored Division is ordered to make a dash towards the city of Paderborn.
Paderborn was a very important post for us. That's where the main panzer schools were. That's why we were headed up in that direction.
The Americans fear the German panzers based at the Paderborn Training Center will mount a counterattack. So the city must be captured, and quickly.
This drive from Marburg to Paderborn, about 90 miles, 144 kilometers, and we did it in 1 day.
I believe it was the longest drive of any armored formation for the U.S. during World War II.
March 30th, 1945. A unit of Sherman, supported by a Pershing from the 3rd Armored Division's 32nd Armored Regiment, spearhead the assault.
We attacked early in the morning. Took off and up the road as fast as we could go. The Germans were surprised. They weren't expecting it. Along the way, going up toward Paderborn, there was a large gun. Was setting up on our right side. I fired and hit it. And took off again and drove hell-bent down the road. We kept moving, so we wouldn't be a hitting target.
In their haste to advance to Paderborn, the American tanks have bypassed a powerful German panzer group that now counterattacks.
So you had a lot of units that were in training that just went right to the fight from Paderborn, and they were able to kind of get in behind the spearheads, create some confusion.
The tank commander grabbed me by the shoulder and said, "Take the tank." Here a Mark V German Panther coming down behind us. So I had HE, an explosive shell in the chamber. Turned the turret as hard as I could to come around. I fired the explosive shell. and got an armor-piercing shell in, came around and pulled the trigger and hit him right dead center in the front, right at the heaviest part of the armor, and it penetrated, went right on through, knocked him out. It was a tough fight all the way. Out of all the tanks, well, 15 tanks attacking down there, only 2 of us made it.
The battle for Paderborn is fierce and bloody. But after 3 days of fighting, the Americans overwhelm its defenders, who surrender on April 1st. That day, U.S. forces complete their encirclement of the Ruhr region, sealing the fate of Army Group B. The commander of the defeated German forces, Field Marshal Walter Model, commits suicide rather than surrender.
The capture of the Ruhr industrial region in Western Germany would have crippled what was left of the Germans' ability to manufacture aircraft, tanks, pretty much their ability to conduct the war.
The days of the Third Reich are now numbered. Soviet artillery begins to shell Berlin on April 20th, the birthday of Adolf Hitler. He calls for reinforcements in a last-ditch effort at holding off the Red Army.
With the resources being diverted to the Eastern Front, it was very difficult for the Germans to compete on an equal footing with their American and British counterparts.
As they move eastward and closer to Berlin, the 3rd Armored Division encounters little opposition in the small villages and towns, as many enemy troops simply surrender at the sight of American tanks. The Americans' next objective is Dessau, the last major city protecting the highway to Berlin. It is just 130 kilometers from the German capital, and defended by some of Hitler's most fanatical troops. April 21st, 1945. Troops and tanks of the 3rd Armored Division prepare for the assault on Dessau.
When we were making our move, the whole task force was going. And I had never seen them all at one time. Our own 32nd Armored was in the northeast. And that's where the last remnants of the fighting was going on.
Though Dessau is in ruins, the German garrison here has been reinforced with Hitler's most powerful tank. The King Tiger is the largest tank the Germans have built. Also called the Royal Tiger, it weighs 70 tons and has 150 millimeters of frontal armor, and is armed with a high-velocity 88 millimeter main gun that is more than 6 meters long. Hitler believes the King Tiger can outmatch any Allied tank and help turn the tide of war. Though immense, it is surprisingly agile. And in the ruins of Dessau, one waits to ambush the enemy. The 33rd Armored Regiment of the 3rd Armored Division slowly makes its way into Dessau. And with the Americans is their own Iron Giant, the Super Pershing, America's answer to the King Tiger.
The Super Pershing was definitely the next stage of the evolution of American armor. Only one Super Pershing was used in combat in World War II.
The Super Pershing is an upgraded version of the Pershing tank. It has 140 millimeters of frontal armor and a new long-barreled 90 millimeter main gun that can penetrate more than 200 millimeters of steel.
The tank that we got into was that one-of-a-kind tank. This was a case where this Tiger Royal, this is the big guy, one of the few that I saw at this end of the war. And he was the one that was waiting for us.
For the only time in the war, a King Tiger is about to face off with a Super Pershing in a duel.
And they fired at us as we came around the corner. Fortunately, their shot went high. And so I fired at them, and I hit them. Glanced a pretty serious blow. And then I got ready to fire and hit them again. They were coming toward us, and they were coming up over a pile of rubble. And the underside of their tank was completely exposed. And when I hit that thing, it exploded with all that ammo and everything. It destroyed that tank. Tank commander, he was surprised. He said, "Great shot, kid. You really did it."
As the clash of these armored titans ends, the crew of the Super Pershing has little time to savor the victory as the battle for Dessau continues to rage around them. In the final days of World War II, the Americans control much of the city of Dessau. Yet the German defenders still hold out, knowing that if the city falls, the road to Berlin will be open.
We're well into Germany. We're past the Rhine. You know, surely they'll quit. They didn't. You know, it was a fight right on to the very end.
The battle becomes street to street. American 3rd Armored Division tanks support infantry, clearing out the last pockets of resistance.
We continued. I mean, that wasn't the end of the war for us. I mean, we were still in Dessau, and we were taking the city to the end. As we were driving, we got fired on by a Panzer. And it did glance a blow off of us. Now, they had to turn their turrets around. They didn't have a power traverse like we had. And so it took time. And so while he was doing that, I told our driver, I said, "Let's get out of here. I want to get it located, but we want to get that guy." There was a big factory there. We just backed into that. So we'd be out of the way. We were in the building itself. And we could sit there and we watched for the tanks to come. And that's when I fired. I hit that drive sprocket. And they stopped. And then I didn't waste any time. My loader told him to load up. And then I hit him a second time. And that destroyed that tank.
The city of Dessau surrenders to the Americans on April 23, 1945. 7 days after the Americans take Dessau, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. And the next day, the Russians capture Berlin. On May 8, 1945, the war in Europe ends with Germany's unconditional surrender. For the Americans, the campaign has been long and bloody, against an enemy who didn't relent, from the beaches of Normandy to the streets of Berlin.
The casualties the U.S. suffered in April 1945 were about the same as what they suffered in June 1944. Around 10,000 deaths. So even though it seemed like the war's over, the Germans are giving up, they're still fighting to the end.
For the 3rd Armored Division, their place at the vanguard of the 1st Army earns them the nickname Spearhead Division.
The 3rd Armored Division was the first one to go through the Siegfried Line, first one to fire an artillery shell on German soil, first one to shoot down a German plane on German soil. We really earned that name of Spearhead. That's all there was to it.
And being at the spearhead comes with a cost.
The 3rd Armored Division lost over 600 tanks, 2,500 killed, 10,000 who were injured. More tanks and more men than any other armored division in World War II.
I lost my loader, a good friend, and some other buddies, and I realized, Nick, grow up. I was an 18-year-old kid, and I became an 18-year-old man in a short time.